Hey everyone, for this lecture we're going to be looking at the Revolutionary War. So after the Declaration of Independence was sent to King George III, he obviously did not handle that well, and the British Army declared war on the colonies, declared war on the treasonous patriots who were trying to create their own new country. And so that would lead to the 4-year conflict known as the Revolutionary War, when the Continental Army fought the British Army um, for control of the colonies. So I'm sure we've all heard the story of the idea of the Revolutionary War, how America was able to overcome. Spoiler alert, we did win the war. We did become a country. We did defeat the British. But how we were able to do that, you often hear things such as George Washington, how great of a leader he was, how great of a military tactician he was, how he was able to defeat the overmatched British. You'll hear of how the Americans were able to outfight the Redcoats. The British military wore those red uniforms, and so we were able to see how the average man, the Minutemen, the militiamen, these average American men were able to overcome this tyrannical force. And, we have all these myths, how it was kind of destiny, how freedom was destined to win. But in actuality, it was unexpected. This was not what people of the times would have expected really would have happened. The colonies had just recently united. There was only 25% really for the war, strong percent, strong support in the colonies, and many people thought Britain, which was one of the most powerful nations, empires in the world, could easily crush the uprising, could easily crush this revolt. And so it could be more summed up in the idea. George Washington's quote here is that um, the Americans won the revolution. Winning the revolution was little short of a standing miracle. The idea of they barely were able to win. There were several things that got lucky. There were several things that went their way. Several advantages they had. So we also don't talk about this when we talk about the revolution. And so in a lot of ways, you can think back to that terrible 80s ballad by Bon Jovi, Living on a Prayer. And you can see here George Washington kind of, they went for it. They were underdogs and somehow they came out on top. And we'll learn about that. So the Continental Army was formed to defend the colonies, to fight the British in 1776 after the Declaration of Independence. But the Continental Army fell in desperate times. The army had been routed in New York and Pennsylvania. They had basically had to give up the city of New York. Washington pulled his forces out, basically gave it to the British so because they couldn't face them directly in New York. And the militia was shrinking quickly in size. It started off as a 28,000 man force, and it shrunk to 3,000 by the winter of 1776. So the militia was almost on the verge of disbanding. You have to remember, these are not necessarily all trained military men. Many of them aren't trained military men. Many of these are these Minutemen, these militias that rose up to fight with the Continental Army from their colonies, and they are quickly leaving. They're being defeated. So they're really desperate times as soon as the war starts. So as I said, the Continental Army had given up most of New York and Pennsylvania, the colonies, and the army was being chased by a British force of 8,000. So remember, the militia force, the Continental Army, is down to 3,000. They're being chased by 8,000 British forces. Supplies were running out, and morale was low. I mean, they had been defeated. They were getting pushed back. This was one of the strongest powers in the world. You have to think about what an underdog they were here. So they're running from that. So in December of 1776, the situation is dire for the Continental Army. They've been pushed out of those big colonies, and they've lost their forces. Things are not looking good. And so actually, Washington's advisors come to him and are recommending that he surrender, that they cannot go on. But Washington comes up with a bold idea of crossing the Delaware River on Christmas Day in 1776, December 25th, and taking a force of 24,000 men to attack 1,400 Hessians at Trenton, New Jersey. Hessians are actually German mercenaries, so they're paid soldiers that came from a German territory that worked for the British, that are basically there as rather than having British direct soldiers, they're there, and they are celebrating Christmas on that day. So Washington creates this bold plan of attack. This is where you get the famous picture here of Washington crossing the Delaware, looking patriotic with the sun shining in the back. But we also don't tell you is that idea that he was attacking mercenaries on the day after Christmas. Many of these men were drunk. They had been celebrating. So they wake up on the day after Christmas. He crossed the river on Christmas Day, wake up from their Christmas celebration to an attack. So Washington was actually able to succeed. This was a small but pivotal victory in the war. It kind of began to turn the tides a little bit, showed that the Americans could fight. So Washington and the Continental Army had successfully captured Trenton on December 26. So the Continental Army held that, but General Charles Cornwallis, the leader of the British Army, quickly moved his troops, 8,000 troops, in a movement that actually outflanked Washington, cut off to where Washington was next going to try to go. And so on New Year's Day, Washington's force of 5,000 poorly trained men were massed in Trenton. And Cornwallis was there. He arrived the next day with an army of about 8,000 troops. There were some skirmishes on the American lines, and there were 3 attempts to cross a bridge, but Cornwallis was unable to reach Trenton and unable to directly attack the Continental Army, but he assumed that he had Washington trapped in Trenton. But however, that night, Washington deployed 500 men to keep the campfires going, while the rest of his troops made a nighttime march to the town of Princeton, 18 miles away. To keep their movement secret, their torches were extinguished and wagon wheels were muffled in heavy cloth, so you couldn't hear them. They basically snuck away at night, left their fires going, so tricked Cornwallis, who thought he had them trapped. So after Cornwallis realizes that the Continental Army has retreated, he begins to make a move towards Princeton in pursuit of the army. However, Washington sent out a colonel or her General Hugh Mercer to destroy a bridge to try to stop the advancement of the British Army, but they actually met a small contingency force of the army there and engaged them in combat on January 3rd. So during this engagement, Washington actually rides up and led from the front. He was only 30 yards from the British troops, and he is quoted as saying, "Parade with us, my brave fellows. There is but a handful of enemy, and we shall have them directly." This is a small British force, so they see the opportunity. Washington sees the opportunity to attack a smaller force, not the entire 8,000 army, and so that's what he does, and he's really bold about it. You know, he's the general of the entire army. He's seen here parading up and down the lines, kind of leading his men on, being that true leader. So the outcome of the Battle of Princeton is that it really changed the perception of the war, especially on the British side. The Americans were able to inflict heavy casualties. They inflicted 232 casualties, dead and wounded, and captured 250, compared to the Americans who suffered 72 dead and wounded and only had 1 captured. So there's a huge discrepancy in those numbers. The Americans were very successful today. The key to this also was that it cut the British Army in half. The move that Washington made, they found that small contingency and basically cut the 2 armies in half. So one side was on the other, they attacked that, and one side was back at Trenton. So that side did not engage in combat, but the army was effectively cut off. And what happened is General William Howe, who had been leading the Continental Army, was one of the generals who led the Continental Army in New York and was pushing Lincoln back, actually had to contact Parliament and ask for reinforcements, and this really shocked Parliament. They thought this was going to be a quick victory. They thought that they were pushing back, the Americans were at the brink, and the next thing they know, Princeton changes their entire perception, the entire idea. Now they're asking for reinforcements when they thought the war would be over in a matter of months. So as we've talked about, the Americans were big underdogs in this, and these battles kind of show and kind of a microcosm of the war as a whole. So Gordon Wood, a famous historian, is quoted as saying, "America did not so much win the war as allow Britain to lose it." And so what that means is in these battles in Trenton and in Princeton, Washington is actually trying to get away from the main British army led by Cornwallis here. He's trying to run, and what happens is he sneaks out of Trenton Cornwallis thinks he has him captured, thinks he's going to crush the Continental Army. That's the end of the war. He sneaks out of there, and then on Princeton, he runs into a smaller division, smaller section of the British Army and fights them, wins, and is able to split the British Army. So he's not fighting the main British Army. He's running from a force that's almost 2.5 times the manpower. He can't fight them directly. So basically, what he's doing is not allowing them to win, is allowing Britain to overextend itself. And the reason that Washington is doing this is because he understands what we do now, looking back on it. Britain was clearly stronger. The colonial army should not have stood a chance against them. Britain had more troops. They were better equipped. They were better trained. They had a stronger navy, and they won the battles. In the battles in which they would face each other directly, the Continental Army didn't stand a chance. They were quick to retreat. So America was a severe underdog in this war. But as we all should know, sometimes the underdogs win. Sometimes the underdog is able to find a weakness, find something, exploit it, and win. As we see here in the Rocky movies. If you've ever seen Rocky, Rocky's the boxer on the left there, and this is from Rocky IV. He's fighting the giant boxer from the Soviet Union. But in these movies, Rocky is always placed as the underdog, and somehow he overcomes, uses his willpower, uses intelligence to win the boxing match. And in the same way, the Americans did that against the British. So as we talked about, one of the reasons that the Americans were an underdog in this is that they were divided. The colonies were not united against it. I mean, the colonies had come together in ways that had never been seen before, but they were still not united. So only a minority of Americans supported the war. But the people who did support the war supported it feverishly. So this is about 25% of the colonists were patriots, so 1 in 4, and they really supported Locke's ideas of natural rights and Thomas Paine's ideas of the grievances with the British Empire, with Great Britain. And they were really inspired by the quote from Patrick Henry of "Give me liberty or give me death." These are the people who are willing to fight for their beliefs, willing to fight for what they think, for freedom, to fight to have their own country, to get rid of the British. And these are the people who joined the Continental Army. So you have to think about how they would fight. This is their homeland. They think their freedom is being taken away from them, and they know the country. So you've got to think that is very inspirational for them. Of course, you have 25% of the colonists who were known as loyalists or Tories. These are people who still saw themselves as British. You know, they had cultural and economic ties to Britain, and they thought those should not be broken. They had a good deal. Their taxes weren't as bad, and the taxes were justified due to the Indian threat. There were still threats from the natives, even after the French and Indian War, and they thought the taxes were there to help pay for the protection that they got from the British Army. They liked the way of life. So you got to think 1/4 of them did not want to have war. The other 50% of the colonists were simply neutral. They stayed out of the war. And this is what we'll see. We'll watch the movie The Patriot, and this kind of gets into more details about that aspect. But you have to remember how big the colonies were at this point. Think about someone living in our area in Roanoke, Virginia, with a small farm, a subsistence farmer. Do you think he really cares about his freedom? He doesn't care about that idea of British. He's never even seen a redcoat. He doesn't know. So like most people lived far away from the conflict. They didn't care. They wanted to maintain their way of life. They had escaped to the New World to kind of live their own life. So they weren't involved in the war. They wanted to stay neutral, stay out of it. So one of the reasons the Americans were able to overcome as underdogs was they had a little help from the French. The French are very important and vital to the U.S. war effort. They supplied money, and they were also a huge aspect in the Battle of Yorktown, which we'll talk about in just a second. But you have to think of it in this terms. Think of the idea of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So the French and British had been at war for years, off and on for over hundreds of years. They had antagonized each other, and so the French see an opportunity to really get back at the British for that loss in the French-Indian War. So they begin supporting the Americans, but they didn't immediately do this. It took Ben Franklin negotiating the Treaty of Alliance So they kind of held out for a while. The French didn't really know if they wanted to get in, didn't know if they thought maybe the Americans could be beaten quickly. But it was actually in the fall of 1777, the American Continental Army was able to defeat the British Army in 2 battles at Saratoga. And this is when Franklin is able to negotiate this treaty, and basically France signs a formal declaration of alliance with the Continental Army, with the colonies. So another reason for the victory is just the enthusiasm of the British. You have to think the they are not as enthusiastic as the Americans in protecting the Americans, protecting their homeland, protecting. They're trying to create new country, trying to fight for freedom. The British troops are over here trying to maintain a colony. It's just not the same enthusiasm. And the war was unpopular in Britain. Many people pushed for an end to war as the war continued to drag on. So they thought originally it was going to last very shortly. They were beating the Americans to start off the war, pushing them out of New York, pushing them out of Pennsylvania. But the Americans kept pestering them, kept fighting back and prolonging the war. So as we said, the Americans did not so much win the war as the British lost it. The enthusiasm for war as it goes on kind of continued to die in Britain. So another reason for victory was the military prowess of the Continental Army. George Washington successfully led the Continental Army. He was a great general. A lot of our myths and things we build up might not be true about Washington, but he was a great leader of the army. His leadership kept the army together during some really hard times. In particular, the winter in Valley Forge was a really hard winter between December 1777 and January 1777, and he kind of kept morale up as morale was really dying. It was a cold winter, and he kept his troops motivated, ready to fight, to keep going. He also avoided situations that would have destroyed his military forces. We saw in Trenton and Princeton, he would often move away and fight a smaller force if he had to. They also engaged in what were known as guerrilla tactics, kind of hit and run warfare. The British would line up, and we'll learn more about this. The British would line up in those red coats in straight lines. The Americans would hit and run. So they wouldn't face them directly. They couldn't face a power like that directly. And basically, Washington's goal was just to try to outlast the British. Keep running, keep fighting them, hitting them when you can, but don't face them directly. Don't allow that huge defeat. So Washington was very successful in this. And so, guys, basically, they stay in. I said in 1777 is Valley Forge that winter. The Americans keep fighting. The morale of the British keeps going down, keeps dropping, and so that all leads to the Battle of Yorktown, which is the decisive battle that ended the war. This battle was fought from September of 28th of 1778 to October 19th, 1778. So what happens is Yorktown is a small town near Washington, D.C. Today. And basically, General Cornwallis has his entire force stationed here. The British Navy is stationed here as well. You can see that in red on this map. And the American forces are down below. You can see Washington in blue and Rochambeau up here. And this is when the French forces really come in. So the French and the American forces surround Cornwallis. And surround his forces here. And what you can't see here is the French fleet. The French Navy lines up as well. So Cornwallis really has nowhere to go. He is left here surrounded on land and at sea. So really the French influence there is also important. You really have to know that as well, looking at this battle. So what Cornwallis does is he surrenders. He surrenders the British Army to the Continental Army. So the culmination of the underdog story is this victory at Yorktown. With the help of the French, Washington was able to surround Cornwallis and the British, and Cornwallis surrendered. This predicament kind of proved to the British, to the Parliament, that this war was not worth fighting anymore, that they were not going to win easily. Obviously, they had been at war for almost 5 years now. So they basically outlasted the British and trapped them. And so this is really when the Americans win the war. The British have surrendered. They have their country now. So moving forward, we'll see what they do with this victory.